Welcome everyone to the Center for Black Studies postdoctoral presentations. I am very excited and pleased that we've had 3 postdocs this year. And one of our postdocs and our graduate fellow presented last year. And for this spring, we are all presenting, everyone that's a fellow at the center. And I am very, very excited about showcasing the works that we are doing here with the postdocs. We've had some amazing scholars here at the center for the last year, and welcome. And I'd like to introduce Dr. Joaquin Noguera, who will be our first speaker, I believe. And then Dr. Michael Dzordzormenyoh will be our second speaker. They will have 15 minutes to speak, and then we will have, is it 15 or 20 minutes? Well, somewhere around that time to speak, and then we'll have the last 20 minutes for questions. Thank you so much, and welcome to the Center for Black Studies. I am the director at the center. My name is Dr. Sharon Tediga. Thank you again.
Thank you, Dr. Tediga, for that introduction.
You're muted, Joaquin.
Am I muted still? Can you hear me? Okay. I appreciate you, Dr. Tediga. Thank you for the intro. I'm going to share my screen now. My title of my talk is called Schooling is Marriage, Self-Determination, Counter-Hegemonic Education, and Repurposing Schools for Black and Brown Children. I just want to start by expressing some gratitude Santa Barbara and acknowledging some important acknowledgements. Santa Barbara is on Chumash land. I'm actually calling in from Los Angeles, which is Gabrielino Tongva land. I want to acknowledge the people who were brought to this land against their will to develop this land. Also giving thanks to Dr. Sharon Tediga, who's created this platform to allow us to share our thoughts, our research, and some important words with you all. So I want to start by just clarifying that my research addresses a broader problem that is being tackled in different ways across the country. This is a problem of schools, districts, states in general, schooling to ensure that all children, especially poor children of color, receive an education that prepares them with the skills, knowledge, and understandings necessary for fulfilling and successful life. But I also look at it from a different perspective, that perspective of teachers, of families rather, families who are unable to or lack confidence in the ability of schools to see the full potential of their children and to care for the social, the emotional, and needs of their children, to make sure that they're understood, appreciated, and nurtured. Some have talked about this as being an achievement gap, which in general speaks to disparities in outcomes between Black, Indigenous, and Latinx students as compared to white and certain Asian peers. Usually in terms of test scores, graduation rates, but also discipline records and overall experiences. Others have been critical of the narratives around achievement gaps, pointing out that this is an educational debt. We're talking about historically oppressed peoples. Following that line of thinking, some have shown that there are different opportunities for different people from different backgrounds. And so there's an opportunity gap. Importantly, there's also a teacher-student gap. 80% of our teachers are white women. And in public schools, we're serving mostly students of color these days. So the gaps are also related to larger conversations around meeting the social emotional needs of young people. And right now, the research is very clear that social emotional needs continue to develop across our lifetimes. So neglecting them and the origins of schooling in this country actually create barriers for us meeting the needs of young people. As a social scientist, I also assert that history is relevant here, right? And I want to remind us of the context of our work as educators, the context of schooling, because schools were formed out of a colonial era in this country. And this country is in itself a settler colony. So defining settler colonialism is really important. It's a form of colonialism in which outsiders come to a land and inhabit it that's already inhabited by Indigenous people, and then claim it as their own. It's not just an event, it's a structure and a process. And generally speaking, it was central to the political project of racial construction in this country. Those of us who are taking critical perspectives on Blackness also critique settler colonialism's use of anti-Blackness and the way it's been systematized to shape people's lived experiences and everyday reality. Ultimately, though, settler colonialism denies people of color, Black and Indigenous people especially, a sense of belonging in settler colonial spaces. Leaves many wondering, where is our home? And why might we not feel home? Because if we're not feeling like we're at home in our homes, it's a barrier to our ability to thrive. Importantly, there's a scholar by the name of Neil Roberts who has argued that our notion of freedom is under-theorized. He's put forward a thesis called Freedom as Marinage. And his argument is basically that if we want to know about freedom, we need to consider the experiences of the unfree. And he uses a historical framework to consider the experiences of people of African descent who have chosen to flee from settler spaces, from colonized spaces, in order to pursue freedom. In this way, he describes marinage, or the escape of these settler spaces of the white gaze, as Toni Morrison called it, as an advancement towards freedom. Marinage, or maroonage, which is known by many names, occurred across the Americas. I include this just to show that it's actually not just specific to the United States, but it also did happen here, right? People escaped and were able to form their own communities outside of settler spaces. And usually these were diverse communities, people from different parts of Africa, people from different indigenous groups that were able to work together and form their own community and had a vision for what life should be like outside of those oppressive spaces. I question whether this is actually a path to freedom, right? Partly because even in escape, people held trauma, people were injured and harmed from their experiences in colonial spaces. And at times those same harms, those same toxic aspects of life could resurface, be reproduced in these new spaces. And yet, it was an act of self-determination. It was a way of taking ownership of one's life and taking your body. One thing that you do have full control of, because if I choose to roll my eyes, I'm also exercising some self-determination, and removing it from that space. Some would argue that this is really old news, this is history, and I would argue, I came across a meme actually, where I learned that when Harriet Tubman was born, Thomas Jefferson was still alive. And when she passed away, Ronald Reagan was alive. And we often treat this as if it's the past, and it doesn't matter, but the past is, the history is being made every day. And so using a socio-historical analysis is critical, I think, for understanding today. Importantly, in settler spaces, the frontier takes on significant meaning. It's a construct that allows the settler to break its own rules. And in this country, it's a part of the mythology of how this country came to be. When I apply this to schooling, I'm not alone, right? There are a number of scholars who have said that our schooling systems as mechanisms of social and cultural reproduction are actually oppressive. They're a part of the settler colonial project, and therefore we must be critical of what takes place in our schools. I have argued that there is a way of we need to name these patterns in education and schooling, and I've called them frontier education practices, frontier education culture. And what I describe them to be are systems, structures, practices, and processes that function as a mechanism of social and cultural reproduction that actually sustain the white settler colonial project and worldview. They tend to be informed by deficit views towards people of color, and ultimately are about denying systematically our belonging. So you will see that in our curriculum, in the pedagogy that is used, in discipline records, in all of the things that we look at when we talk about the achievement gap. I use this image, which is an historical artifact from 1899 called School Begins, partly because I think it's worth analyzing, which we're not going to do right now, but Uncle Sam is the teacher who is ultimately a representative of the state. And regardless of your background as a teacher, as an educator, when stress develops, educators can tend to resort to frontier education practices that, again, begin to exclude and deny students of color, especially Black, Indigenous, and Latinx students, a sense of belonging in learning spaces. Shifting a bit now to a specific territory, a specific area, Oakland, California, where a study I conducted took place. Oakland is a community that is diverse, has a large working class and large Black and Latinx population, has been criticized largely for its challenges in schools. It's been taken over by the state at some points in its recent history, and we've seen a number of teacher strikes. It's been accused of fiscal mismanagement. And for those of us who have lived there, there's also a very real reality of violence shaping young people's lives and shaping the experiences of educators in Oakland. Oakland, importantly, is also, and the Bay Area in general, a place where a number of really important social justice movements, self-determination movements took place. So here are just listed a few. I've listed just a few from the free speech movement, Black Panthers, LGBTQ movement, even more recently, the Occupy movement, and Black Lives Matters was first tweeted out of Oakland. So the legacy of and consciousness around resistance and self-determination for historically oppressed peoples in Oakland is strong. And it was in Oakland that an email was sent to me back in December 15th, 2012, where some educators were gonna get together, and the title was To Build Our Own School. I wasn't able to make the meeting, but I stayed in touch with the project, and over time I learned that the creation of a new school did take place. The school was called Roses and Concrete Community School. The name of the school was inspired by the book of poetry that was written by Tupac Shakur. And the leaders described that this image captures the need to celebrate the tenacity and will of the rose that against all odds finds ways to grow in an inhospitable and toxic environment. And they hoped that this school would provide such an atmosphere for young people. So I led a study that looked at how the school went about meeting the social, emotional, and the academic needs of young people. And it took place over several years, from its design stage on through the school's closure. The school was closed in 2020. But what I learned was that Roses was a very special case. Unlike most schools, and I worked with schools as a consultant and as a coach to educators and school leaders for the past 12 years. And I haven't seen many spaces that actually assert that we must serve as buffers against toxic stress for young people and families. The long-term goal of Roses and Concrete is to create a model for urban education that prioritizes the needs of young people and their families as a way of building healthy and sustainable communities. And they built it around an interpretation of Maslow's hierarchy of need, believing that they would not be able to meet young people and their families' needs without first addressing psychological needs and safety, providing a sense of love and belonging, feeding, nourishing self-esteem, and ensuring that everyone felt a sense of accomplishment so that they could self-actualize. As I got to the school, I came to know that the space, how they operationalized these ideas was really important. It was a very clear and transparent focus on social justice education. And this was done through ethnic studies by centering the experiences and perspectives of people of color in this country, specifically the experiences of those involved in the movements in the Bay Area. It was also a Spanish-English dual immersion program, which was part of an effort to facilitate Black and Brown solidarity. Never met a school like that. And they considered themselves a lab school. So they invited others from around the community, around the world, to come and see what they were doing, to ask questions, to learn with them. Being in the space over several years, what I saw was a community responsive operation. So young people were being encouraged to develop critical consciousness, interrogating dominant narratives and society's beliefs and comparing them with their own, becoming critical of them and taking a stand. The school had organized itself to to respond systematically to the challenges that young people were facing, and as well as their families. So various forms of committees and projects were developed to respond to day-to-day challenges that families were facing. And this was from the time of the Trump presidency on through the end of his presidency. So they were also responding to the times, to the different events that were unfolding during that time period. They had also declared themselves another image of success, the success of the warrior scholar, because they believed that it was not about just escaping the neighborhood, it was also about transforming the neighborhood. And the warrior scholar was someone who's going to succeed in the existing system, but able to transform it as they succeeded in the system. In speaking with some families, I spoke with a teacher who told me, look, this stuff is deep. This person was someone with about 20 years of experience teaching. She said, I'm seeing Black mothers come in, dropping their kids off and saying, I never knew anyone could love my kid the way you guys love my kid. I never knew that a school could feel like this. Thank you. In speaking with another parent, I asked what the hopes and dreams were for a school like Rose's. And she said, for my babies to come out loving themselves and loving their community, knowing that love is inclusive. You can't just love me because of how I look. You have to love everybody. Come out knowing that you are someone. I want their experience to be different than mine, to know about different cultures, to come out with a strong sense of self, to love themselves. So in my time in the field, what I learned was that there was real power in a community that had really bought in to this idea. The teaching staff matched the students. It was almost all Black and brown teachers. There were a couple of white teachers, and it was not that the school believed that white teachers couldn't do this work. It was that they believed that the students and families deserved to work with young people who understood them and who looked like them. And there's actually research that shows that with just one Black teacher, young Black students are more likely to go to college. And in general, students do better when they have teachers of color, students of all backgrounds, including white students. There was also the discourse that this was very different than a lot of other learning spaces where young people were called roses. And that helped to shape my lens for roses. Roses is not just students, but their families as well, right? That roses actually come from roses, and the school took an approach that embraced families in all that they bring, which was challenging, but it also shed some light on what equity has to mean. And it has to mean that we get to know our students in our community, the communities that they come from, and build our capacity in response to the needs. So what they did was to successfully repurpose a school that was John Sweat School, and develop the Roses and Concrete Community School. And in this sense, I considered it a case of marriage, in that what happened over time was that families who were struggling in existing Oakland schools started to flock to Roses, right? And importantly, charters themselves are part of what many have called a neo-colonial movement that is actually taking away public space. But within the charter movement, there are these anti-colonial movements that are community-driven, and Roses is an example of that. It's an example of what I think educators of social justice must do every day, which is to challenge Audre Lorde's assertion that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, that we cannot afford to actually accept that. We have to test it every day. In fact, because the master didn't build his or her own house in this country, right? And it's actually a lot of indigenous, African knowledge that went into the construction of those houses. And so repurposing them is valid, right? Repurposing the tools. Roses worked in a systematic way in an attempt to respond to different kind of harm at different levels, what I called wounds, which are structural and historical harms, but also day-to-day hurt. What we learned over time, though, was that the school was really strained by the amount of need that came into the school. As a refuge for some families, the school ultimately was overwhelmed by the need, and they struggled to make the internal organizational changes that were necessary to respond to that need and build the capacity in the ways that they needed to. It was also really challenging to work in those spaces. And the high turnover among teachers who said, look, I have bills to pay. I am down to support this project, but it's so taxing. I'm working so late. I can't afford to give up this much time. That meant that institutional memory was lost. the community had to recreate itself year after year, which really was not sustainable. Ultimately, in the end, what I walked away from this space knowing was that traditional demands of schools are not alleviated when we take an anti-hegemonic stance. So in an interview with one of the founders, I learned about one of the final calls they had with the charter authorizers. And they said to the founder, are reading scores, or no, this person said to them, are reading scores evidence of student progress? By the way, student test scores were a bit lower than neighboring schools. They said immediately, yes. Okay, is cultural identity evidence of student progress? And they said no. And the founder said, well, then we're done here. You don't have the authority to evaluate us because we're a community school. We have the right to self-determine what progress is for our own children, and that includes me. I'm speaking to you as a parent whose children go to this school. I'm telling you, I'm more interested in whether or not my children, my sons, have a strong cultural identity than what their scores are on a state reading test. I'm not saying I don't care if my sons can read. I'm saying that I know if my sons can read and they don't know who they are and where they come from, that they're going to be sick. I'm also saying that I know if my sons know who they are and where they come from, it's only a matter of time before they learn to read. So one of these is a leading indicator of pupil progress, and one of them is a lagging indicator. You're talking to me as if you believe that the lagging indicators are leading indicators, and that the leading indicators don't matter. For that reason, I find you to be morally defunct. And they didn't like that. Obviously, the authorizers would not accept such an argument. And the school was ultimately closed. What I learned from Roses, though, was that there was great power and potential in a community getting together and declaring themselves what their school was going to have to be about. And in this case, it was about restoration of well-being and meeting the needs of the predominantly Black and Brown students. The school was about split 50-50 Latinx and Black, meeting the needs of the students and the families they served. And the reproduction of problematic patterns that existed in other spaces was bound to resurface. And so I use this phrase that real roses have thorns, and that we actually have to have a systematic plan that responds to the full beauty of young people and their families. So I'm gonna pause here and hand over the mic, and I thank you for your time sharing this story of schooling as marriage with you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Noguera, for your wonderful presentation. I also want to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Tetega and everybody who is present here today for my presentation. My presentation shifts a little bit from what Dr. Noguera presented. So I'll be looking at police brutality today, and And my research topic basically looks at police brutality in non-traffic stop situations. So one will ask, why is this really important? Police brutality is something that has historical and then current relevance. And we talk about it every day in our homes or with our colleagues and with our families. But most of the studies that have been done prior to my study or what I'm looking at today has focused more on police brutality that have to do with traffic stops. So there have not been enough research that have been done in relation to non-traffic stop. So that is one of the reasons why I decided to look at non-traffic stop to understand the factors that influence police use of force during non-traffic stops. So what do we know about police brutality and in the existing literature? So one of the things that exists in the literature is that there's consensus about police work and then the use of some level of force, what is called reasonable force. At the same time, there is also consensus regarding police brutality and how it is unacceptable and has negative consequences on not just officers, but also the people who go through that and then their families. The literature also suggests that non-white racial groups and minorities experience a lot of police brutality compared to white. The previous literature on police brutality that focus on traffic stop has identified that citizen misdemeanor and hostility towards officers is one of the factors that influence police officers' use of force. The literature also has identified that when a person is stopped during traffic stops and there's a background check on the person and it is revealed that the person has a criminal background, that also influences the possibility of police officers using force. There are other situational and extralegal factors that also influences police officers' use of force. But beside these factors, the socio-demographic features of a person like age, race, and income also have been found to influence the use of force by police officers during traffic stops. So my goal was to find out whether these things that have been identified in relation to traffic stop can be found or can be seen as predictors of non-traffic stops and police use of brutality. So what did I set out to do in my research? So basically, my research looked at two aspects of police brutality when it comes to non-traffic stops. The first one was about verbal abuse. Do police officers use verbal abuse on citizens during non-traffic stop exposures and situations? The second one is to look at lethal force, the use of lethal force. So I'm going to show and break down what I mean by verbal abuse and what I mean by the use of lethal force. So with lethal force, there was 3 questions that I put together to measure lethal force. Did the police officer threaten to arrest you? Did the police officer actually push or grab you? And did the police officer handcuff you in any way when they interact with citizens in non-traffic stop situations? With verbal attack, I looked at questions that had to do with, did the police officer shout at you, or did the police officer curse you or curse at you when he stopped you? I also looked at the effect of other factors on police use of force, and some of those effects were like reasons why the police officer stopped a person during a non-traffic stop situation. So suspected you of something, match you to a description of someone that the police officer is looking for, seeking information about another person, investigating a crime, providing a service or assistance to you during that encounter. I also included socio-demographic variables like race, gender, age, and income of not just the citizens, but also police officers. In terms of the result, what did I find from my studies? I observed that verbal assault against police officers, when it comes to verbal attacks or police officers using verbal attacks on citizens, verbal assault against officers by citizens influences the use of force by police officers. Also, the gender of the suspect also affects officers' use of verbal attack on the citizen. I also observed that other racial groups, that is non-white racial groups, are more prone to experience verbal attacks from police officers. Although white people also experience verbal attacks, but that was not a significant predictor of police use of verbal attack on citizens. When it comes to the use of lethal or brutal force, I also observed that verbal assault against officers leads to the use of brutal or lethal force by police officers on citizens during non-traffic stops. Also, officers' race, especially white police officers, are more likely to use brutal force when it comes to their encounters with citizens during non-traffic stops. Also, the gender of the suspect also determines the use of lethal force against that citizen during non-traffic stops. I also observed that the income of the individual being stopped, that is, when the person earns between $25,000 and $50,000 yearly, also influences the use of force by police officers. There are several limitations with the study, but I would like to talk about a couple of them. Usually when you are using survey data, there's the limitation of desirability bias. Basically, what that means is that people tend to provide answers and to questions so they may look good and they may look credible. So that could have affected the final outcome or final result of the study. That I have no control over it, so I have to account for it and say that there could be those issues of desirability bias in the final results. Also, the measure of brutality can be expanded in the future, though this study only focused on a couple of them. The measure of brutality that was used, verbal, and then the use of lethal force, and then the questions that were included can be expanded in the future. Overall, what does this study provide us? The study shows that both the race of citizens and police officers influence the use of brutal force during non-traffic stop. And one of the things that was important for us to understand was that non-white racial groups, especially minorities, experience the use of both verbal and then lethal force during non-traffic stop encounters. Also, the income of citizens influence police use of brutality when it comes to non-traffic stops. Another thing is that citizens' misdemeanor also affect the use of brutal force by police officers. This is an area that I am interested in expanding and understanding, because most studies have found that citizens' hostility and misdemeanor towards police officers influence the use of brutal force by police officers. However, we don't really understand what that measure means when surveys say citizens' misdemeanor. What does it include? And what are the triggers of citizen misdemeanor? What are the factors that trigger citizens' misdemeanor and hostility towards police officers? That is something that I am interested in looking at and expanding on so that it can improve our understanding of what surveys mean by citizen misdemeanor and hostility. These results are consistent with previous results that have been found with traffic stop and police use of brutality. Also, we have to understand that police officers are street-level bureaucrats that have some level of discretion during encounters with citizens. And how can we begin to hold police officers accountable? Though body-worn cameras and other type of surveillance mechanisms have helped to provide more evidence in terms of how citizens interact with police officers and how police officers interact with citizens. That is just one aspect of it. But how can we continue to hold police officers accountable when it comes to their interactions with citizens, especially when it comes to the use of force, lethal force on citizens? Thank you. That will be all for my presentation, and questions are welcome for both me and Dr. Noguera.
Thank you, both of you, for presenting such amazing studies. Yes, we have our little reactions down here and do a little hand clap there. Now we're going to open it up for questions. Please raise your hand, and then you can be called on if you have a question. Thank you. And is it Ziza? Okay, so Ziza, please go ahead and unmute your mic and feel free to ask questions.
If it's okay, I'd like to ask a question to each of the speakers, if we have time. With Joaquin, for your presentation, can you talk a little bit about the feeling of marinage you got on campus? Like how did you come to that finding that you thought that this was essentially served as a maroon community? And can you kind of describe what that campus looked and felt like that got you there?
Sure, thank you. Important question. Well, at the time I was working with several school communities in different parts of the United States, all of them attempting to focus on issues of equity, usually issues of race. In one space in the Midwest, they were trying to facilitate integration. And they were trying to do that by becoming more culturally responsive in the schools that were serving predominantly Black students. But they had teachers that really didn't understand the Black students or their families or their culture. I was working with a school that was only about 10 minutes away, where Spanish-speaking students were being sent to the Office for Speaking Spanish. And I was a part of a group that was trying to work with educators around healing-centered practices. So we were working with a diverse group of educators to get them to understand what this was about. And when every time I would come to Roses, what I encountered were educators who were pretty much on the same page that this has to be healing-centered, that the language and the culture that young people bring is valued and it has to be reflected in the school. And consistently over time, as I was saying in the presentation, families who had been having really challenging times in other schools in Oakland started to come there, started to flock there, see it as a safe space. And so the art, the teaching, the celebrations all reflected community. It was beautiful to see Black and brown folks together, lifting up their culture, lifting up and validating each other. And at the same time, I was working on a project for Indigenous language immersion schools, where Indigenous folks were like, look, our language is a part of our culture and we don't get it other places. They're trying to erase our culture. Whereas Roses was embracing culture and seeking to sustain it. So that's a big part of how I came to schooling as Marinage. And they're reclaiming that space. They reclaimed it for the children from Oakland, children of Oakland.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Is there somebody else who wants to ask a question before I ask Michael? Okay, if not, I'll ask Michael. So Michael, I'm curious, who do you envision your research speaking to? Are you speaking to police and those who work with police trainers? Are you speaking to community? Like, who is the intended audience when you think about your research?
Thank you for your question. My intended audience is the police force, and then also citizens, because one, as I said, it keeps on popping up in most research that citizen misdemeanor correlates strongly with police use of force. So that is an aspect where, as I said, if we can expand on, it will begin to enlighten us as to what really police officers mean by citizen misdemeanor, or what they account for as citizen misdemeanor. Also, police officers' relationship with non-white racial groups also showed in the research that also affects police use of brutality. So how do we move from that stage to train police officers in a way that they understand not just the culture, but the personalities of like other racial groups, and account for that when they have encounters with them?
I see here Team George has asked a question also for both of us. So Dr. Dzordzormenyoh, if you want to take that first question, I can follow you.
Yeah, Tim. So as I said earlier on, one of the weaknesses of survey research is that people usually manipulate the answers that they give you. With that, as a researcher, I cannot account for it and I cannot control for it. I only work with the answers that they have provided in the survey. So there's little that I can do in terms of like dealing with those biases and implicit biases and differences that occur in the survey answers that have been given. But I also believe that despite that, the findings that we get also has a way of working itself out and then adding to the knowledge that we have in one way or the other.
And then the question for me was, can the work of Roses and Concrete be replicated? If so, what are the enabling factors for success and sustainability? Roses was actually inspired by a school in New Zealand that one of the founders visited, where their theory of change was, and theory for success was to embrace culture. It was a school for Maori children and other Pacifica children. This is the indigenous people of the Pacific Islands and the Pacific and of New Zealand, Aotearoa. And what they found over time, they were around for much longer, Kiaroha College, was that as young people developed greater knowledge of themselves and their culture and improved relationships, their literacy scores skyrocketed. Young people who had little knowledge of culture and poor relationships generally had lower literacy scores. This was the attempt. This was also the operational, the theory of change that Roses attempted to use. However, as a charter school, they had a time period to show and prove that their theory would work. And ultimately, after 5 years in the United States, most charters are up for renewal. And that last interview exchange was one of the founders and other leaders at the school interacting with some of the authorizers who, and there's also research showing that there's it's been some questionable activities by the authorizers across the country. And if you get on the bad side of the authorizers, they can ultimately close you down. And to argue that they're defunct for prioritizing literacy over culture and relationships, it's probably not always going to work out too well. It didn't for Roses in this case. So that's part of what they see as their vision for success, but ultimately they have to organize themselves internally to make that work. So I think it is a project that we can learn a lot from. I caution against using a word like replicate, because it should never be seen as an exact model that should be kind of a blueprint for something else. Every community that is attempting to do this needs to really understand themselves and work together. It's really a hyper democratic process. I would argue also that in this period of pandemic, smaller versions of this took place. If I had had more time, I would have gone into what I'm currently working on, which is the many cases of pockets of marriage, communities developing their own small learning communities when ultimately our schools were closed and we couldn't rely on the state to serve our young people anymore. Families got grassroots with it, right? They created new learning spaces. They were very transparent about racial justice issues, about gender, sexuality, about religion, about social class, about social analysis, cultural analysis. And young people, from the parents that I've engaged so far, were thriving, the same young people who struggled in traditional public schools. So in some ways, we're doing this work, but I'm giving it a name. And what I'm trying to do is provide some guidance on successful strategies. And some of the successful strategies are based on dialogue and working with community to be vision, mission aligned. What is our idea of freedom? It's not just freedom to do something, it's also freedom from something. And keeping the vision centered as we build our systems around it. So I think that's part of what makes it sustainable. Thank you, great question.
Yeah, and I think to add to what I said earlier on, I think that body-worn cameras and other type of surveillances also provide us with data that some researchers are really good at analyzing to augment what I have found in my studies. If we see the same trend, then probably the survey answers provided by the citizens, when it matches with what the data from those surveillance equipment and videos and audios produce, then we can say that there's a consensus somewhere about police use of brutality and the causes of police use of force.
Are there any other questions?
Pretty quiet here. We welcome any additional questions, comments. You guys did such a great job. There are no questions. about
I
anything.
I have a question. I was writing it down, but
Go ahead and speak up, Jeremy. Thank you.
True. So thank you both for your presentations. Dr. Noguera, I had a question around the teachers and or educators, part of the Roses in Concrete program or school. So what was the process in terms of the onboarding there, in terms of how educators were integrated into these learning spaces? Was there, some type of, like, in terms of the training, or what did that look like over time? And I guess, yeah, sort of the buy-in with that.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Thank you for that question. I actually took a slide out, which was a posting of job opening at Roses. And the first thing listed on the job opening is that all teachers are required to love and care for these children like they are your own. And that is not something I've worked with many schools over the past decade. And I've never encountered a school that said, and this is verbatim, teachers must aspire to love each and every student as if they were a member of their own family. That in itself, in some spaces, is a contentious issue, right? In Roses, in order to work there, you had to convince the community that was already there that you bring that love. Right? They saw themselves as the first line of defense for students and families. And if you were going to join the community, you were going to join them on that line of defense. Again, one of their mottos was that the single biggest protective factor in the lives of young people who experience toxic stress is a caring adult. And they said that there's also a direct corollary. The more caring adults you have, the stronger the shield. So when you were on the campus, everywhere you looked, you saw people who were showing up in ways that you can't always find in schools, showing up in ways that allow young people to feel seen and heard and known. That's a big part of the culture at Roses. In terms of training, again, around vision and mission alignment, a school that says it's going to support revitalization in the community and support healing should have some skills around revitalization and healing. And so early on, trainings were to understand trauma, to understand systemic and structural violence and how it manifests in historically oppressed communities, specifically in the Black and Latinx communities of Oakland. And large turnover from year to year meant that people needed to be retrained. And it also meant that you had people who hadn't received the training that took place 2 years ago because only half of the people who were here 2 years ago are still here, right? And so there's this kind of the need to revisit learnings that should become normalized in a school, that because of the strains on the school, because of the stress of that very demanding environment, that became a major area of need in the community. And so in the 5th year of the school's operation, I remember interviewing an aide who said, you know what, we're supposed to be restorative justice everything, but I've never been trained in restorative justice. And I kind of see that as an indication of a larger systemic issue. The systemic issue being we need to build capacity to have the skills that match the needs of the young people. But with this large turnover, with people being stressed and overworked, and the very expensive place to live like Oakland, the Bay Area, one of the most expensive places to live, how much are you going to pay your teachers to do this work, right? Well, charters generally have just a slightly smaller budget than traditional public schools. And there's only so much fundraising that the leaders can do to compensate. So ultimately, it wasn't a sustainable operation. And so this goes back to the question that Dr. Ateem George asked around sustainability. They're going to need more funds. They're going to need kind of more involvement and maybe some ways of maybe you can't serve everybody that you want to serve. You have to build an infrastructure. They could have used more social workers, more school psychologists, more teacher aides. They could have used more, but that all costs more money.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
Thank you. That was a great question.
Taylor, have you formulated your question?
Yes, I have. And my question is for Dr. Noguera. So just from listening to your presentation, I think Roses is such a fascinating school. It has such a fascinating impact. Can you yourself envision what it would take or what would be necessary to implement something like Roses on a larger scale?
Large scale is also something that we live in a society. Thank you, though. Thank you, Taylor. That's a great question. Right. We live in a society where we've also kind of been taught that bigger and stronger and faster is better. The research around what it takes to provide high quality learning doesn't suggest that bigger, better, stronger is what's needed. But that goes back to the initial problem that I put out there, right? The problem of families needing schools where their children can be cared for, where their futures can be cared about. I think the challenges are widespread, right? Again, the average teacher is a white woman, middle-class background, and the average student in our public schools today is a student of color from a working class or poor background. You don't know what you don't know. So a lot of people are really prioritizing getting more people of color, especially Black teachers, Black people to become teachers. We need to diversify the teaching force. We also need diverse leaders. We need leaders who understand teaching and learning, who understand that public health and social work are central to the equity work that we need to be done in schools. These can't be seen as not my job, right? We have agreements established with professional workforces that say that you don't have to do certain things that are necessary for young people to be successful. Take, for example, communicating with families. And if you're unwilling to make the time to communicate with working parents at times that work for them, then they're never a part of the conversation. So we actually need to rethink the way our schools work. Our schools, as I tried to point out with frontier education, my theorizing of frontier education, they're structured to maintain the status quo. They do enable upward mobility for some, but more often than not, schools are actually complicit in the recreation of the status quo. So we can't just let schools continue as they've been doing, right? And it actually takes educators who understand these patterns of reproduction and who are very clear about the potential, the pockets where transformation is possible to enter the field. And they need to be supported and encouraged to do that. They need to be compensated appropriately. And we should be all, in my opinion, all actively working to encourage that at a systematic, at a state level, at every level, at a grassroots level. It's going to take a community to change these schools that we need. We need these schools ultimately. Thank you, Taylor. Great question.
Hi. I wanted to jump in with a question. Sorry for the background noise. I was wondering, Joaquin, your research speaks to so many issues in the education space, particularly with like neoliberal education regimes. And so I typed a question in the chat for both you and Mike about naming one to three organizations that you think would like need to hear your message like now. Because I'm a historian, so it's not as, I don't get the same, it's really exciting to see research that can directly like impact things that are happening now. And so I would just love to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you, Amanda. I'll let you go first, Dr. Dzordzormenyoh, please.
Yeah, thank you, Amanda, for your question. I think that with my research, police training institutions, the police force, and even prosecutors and how they view cases related to police brutality can benefit from my research. As I said earlier on in answering our team's question, looking at video surveillance that comes out and audio surveillance, they give credence to some of the findings from my study. So prosecutors can also take advantage of this study in addition to the police force and then police training institutions.
It's a tricky one when I think about organizations because of the way our society is structured. But my first thought is immediately teacher education programs. We need to recognize that when you get a master's in teaching, you're not a master teacher. Right? There's a misconception there that mastery is developed on the job. It's developed through practice, through experience, through getting feedback, through messing up, through getting to try again, right? And one of my old mentors, Grant Wiggins, he's the guy who created Understanding by Design, which uses backward planning. He used to say, most professions require a level of mastery before you get out there in the field. And that means you have apprenticeship, right? A lot of teachers end up having one semester with an experienced teacher who may or may not actually mentor them. That's part of their learning. But how do we make sure that they understand the community that they're working with, right? If I were to ask a group of teachers, you're going to go teach in Costa Rica, South Africa, what do you think you need to do to prepare? They start talking about knowing history. They start talking about understanding the language and the culture. But when I work with a group of TFA teachers about working with kids in East Oakland, what do they need to prepare? They don't say that. They don't say they need to learn the culture and the language and get to develop relationships, right? There's a blockage there. And I think that's also part of the legacy, the genealogy of schooling in this country, which is part of why frontier education is important. It has been used to erase culture, unfortunately, to improve you, to make you better than your parents. And that's fundamentally flawed practice. I think it's also speaking to Black and brown families and what they need to demand from schools, I think, and how they can organize themselves, to curriculum providers and designers, to teachers that are on the job now, who are feeling alone because they're the ones who show up for the students and families, but their colleagues aren't trying to hear that. And ultimately, all of the decision makers, leaders in communities at community level, state level, larger federal level. But as you pointed out, the neoliberal common sense is global, right? People are writing about it. The global education reform movement, GERM. It's not an accident that they call it a GERM, right? That is actually eroding public good like schooling and repurposing it for private interests. So that's my short answer. Thank you, Linda.
Guys, feel free to turn on your cameras, or you want to keep them off, but if you can ask the question verbally, kind of puts that human contact, because we have the space, this virtual space. So instead of typing, Atim, please feel free to ask the question.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tediga. This question is for Dr. Noguera. What are the implications, of any, of the digital revolution for education as Marinage?
Great question. The pandemic exacerbated existing issues of inequity, okay? The same narratives that were explaining away working families' issues, saying that they didn't really care about schooling, that their kids were not doing their homework, they weren't showing up with the right attitudes. Well, when they were required to get on Zoom and they weren't able to, or they had a Zoom class, 3 kids in a Zoom class in one room and the internet was messing up, the narrative started to shift. They weren't reliable with the hotspot that the school had given them. They weren't reliable with the Chromebook, right? Maybe they should stop watching Netflix so much. The deficit views of those communities were reproduced and just re-articulated into a pandemic period. So in many ways, the frontier is now digital, right? And we know things like homework are equity issues, right? If you're a young person whose parents are working in the evening, you're not going to get support with homework, whereas an affluent family is able to provide a tutor. It's almost like there's teacher-proof support at home, right? These are issues that don't go away. when we go digital. They actually get more complex, and that's something that schools actually have to be forward thinking about. So in terms of the implications are vast. Revolution from education as marriage. I think you mean to say marriage. But ultimately, interrupting the isolation that people experience in this pandemic is a big part of the healing-centered practice that Rose's school would advocate for. Making sure that people feel known,
Thank you.
heard, and seen. Yes, thank you.
Okay. All right. Well, there are no other questions. Closing remarks from each of you, please, and then we will say goodbye.
I would like to say thank you once again to Dr. Tediga and everyone who has been able to make it here present to watch our presentations and ask questions and to give feedback and comments. We look forward to even hearing from you. If you have any other questions or feedback, you can email us or send us a message. Thank you.
Thank you. I had the pleasure of traveling to Brazil to go to Quilombo dos Palmares, which was a Quilombo or Maroon community that was established for almost 100 years in Brazil. It was eventually toppled, but multiple generations of African people and indigenous people were able to live and die free from colonial spaces, to be self-defining in their experience. So in the long history, people could say, oh, it was just a blip in the map, just a blip in the timeline. It was eventually colonized. But there were generations of folks who experienced freedom. Roses was around for 5 years. And I'm confident that as I follow up with those families that were in that space, they will go back and describe the freedom, the sense of belonging that they hadn't experienced in other spaces, even though the school is now done. So I think there's a lot to learn from, and I think we can all take some lessons into our own lives. Thank you, Dr. Tediga, for creating this platform, for allowing us to share some words with the people and share our research. And thank you all for such great questions. Thank you, Dr. Dzordzormenyoh, for sharing the mic with me. Appreciate you all.
Thank you all. Have a pleasant day.